Counterterrorism police uncover new evidence in Ann Widdecombe investigation. Ann Widdecombe murder probe takes dramatic turn as terror police dig deeper. Counterterrorism officers remain at the center of the investigation into the killing of Ann Widdecombe, with detectives examining whether the targeted attack had a political or terrorist purpose. The continuing specialist involvement is significant, because police initially said there was no information suggesting terrorism before new evidence changed the direction and leadership of the inquiry. Joshua Kerry, 28, from Rotherham, South Yorkshire, has been charged with Widdecombe's murder. He has not been convicted, and the court must determine whether the prosecution can prove the charge. Police are not currently seeking anyone else, but investigators are examining his alleged motivation, the extent of any planning, and whether he was involved in any wider activity. What is known about the man charged? Kerry was arrested in South Yorkshire on the 11th of July, 3 days after prosecutors allege Widdecombe was killed at her home in Hayter, Devon. He was initially detained on suspicion of murder, before being arrested under terrorism legislation, as information emerged during the investigation. The confirmed personal information released by the authorities remains limited. Kerry is 28, comes from Rotherham, and was not previously known to the PREVENT program, according to a statement made to Parliament by the Home Secretary. PREVENT is the government program intended to identify people considered vulnerable to becoming involved in terrorism. Prosecutors allege that Kerry traveled from South Yorkshire to Devon before entering Widdecombe's home. A court has heard that she was eating lunch when she was struck 21 times on the head with a hammer, and that her wallet was taken before the attacker left the property. Those details are allegations presented by the prosecution and have not yet been tested at trial. The geographical distance is likely to form an important part of the investigation. A journey from Rotherham to rural Devon would appear difficult to reconcile with a purely spontaneous encounter, although travel and preparation alone cannot establish a terrorist motive. Detectives will need to reconstruct the suspect's movements, communications, searches, purchases, and decisions before the alleged attack. Police have described the killing as targeted. That indicates investigators do not believe Widdecombe was selected at random, but it does not by itself establish why she was allegedly chosen. A targeted attack could arise from political hostility, personal fixation, robbery, grievance, delusion, or several motives operating together. Why counterterrorism police took over? Devon and Cornwall police originally retained control of the murder inquiry and said there was no information suggesting a terrorist connection. Counterterrorism policing Southeast then assumed leadership after what officers described as new information and evidence came to light during a dynamic and complex investigation. That transfer does not mean terrorism has been proved. Counterterrorism investigators possess specialist capabilities for analyzing extremist ideology, digital communications, online networks, travel patterns, financing, propaganda, and possible links to other individuals. Their involvement allows those possibilities to be investigated without weakening the underlying murder case. Assistant Commissioner Lawrence Taylor, the head of National Counterterrorism Policing, said investigators were assessing more than 800 lines of inquiry. He confirmed that Widdecombe's public profile, the targeted nature of the attack, and the possibility of political motivation remained active areas of investigation. The Crown Prosecution Service has similarly said that inquiries into Kerry's alleged motives are continuing and include a potential political or terrorist connection. The murder charge was authorized through its Special Crime and Counterterrorism Division, reflecting the unusual seriousness and potential national security dimension of the case. What remains unproven? The most important unanswered question is whether investigators have found evidence that the alleged attack was intended to advance a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. Under UK law, extreme violence does not become terrorism simply because the victim was a politician or because the crime caused national fear. The legal definition generally requires serious action designed to influence government or intimidate the public, carried out to advance a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. Investigators therefore need evidence connecting the alleged violence to a qualifying purpose, rather than merely establishing hatred, obsession, or anger. Possible evidence could include private messages, internet searches, written material, recorded statements, contact with extremist networks, ideological publications, or an explanation of why Widdecombe was selected. Police may also examine whether the suspect showed interest in other public figures, institutions, or potential targets. None of that evidence has been publicly established. Claims circulating about material allegedly discovered at the suspect's home should not be treated as proven unless confirmed through official statements or placed before the court. Active criminal proceedings also impose strict limits on commentary that could prejudice the defendant's trial. It is also possible for an attack to be politically motivated without satisfying every part of the statutory terrorism definition. A personal hatred of a party, policy, or politician might explain victim selection, while still falling short of proving that the act was intended to influence government or intimidate a wider section of the public. What changes if terrorism is established? The murder charge would remain the central allegation, because murder already carries a mandatory life sentence following conviction. A terrorist connection could nevertheless transform the way the offense is presented, sentenced, and managed. English courts can determine that an ordinary criminal offense, including murder, was committed with a terrorist connection. The prosecution does not necessarily need to replace the murder charge with a standalone offense under the Terrorism Acts. British cases involving terrorist killings have previously been prosecuted as murder, while the ideological purpose was reflected in the proceedings and sentence. Where a qualifying offense was committed in the course of terrorism or for terrorist purposes, the court must consider the terrorist connection and treat it as an aggravating factor. The judge must state that finding publicly when passing sentence. A conviction for murder would automatically result in life imprisonment, but the judge would then determine the minimum period that must be served before parole could even be considered. A proven terrorist purpose, extensive planning, the targeting of a public figure, the use of a weapon, and the attack occurring inside the victim's home could all become highly important sentencing considerations. In the most serious murder cases, a whole life order may be considered. That would mean the offender could expect never to be released except in exceptional compassionate circumstances. Whether that threshold was reached would depend on the evidence, the statutory sentencing framework, and the judge's findings after conviction. A terrorist connection could also bring notification requirements, specialist prison management, and long-term counterterrorism monitoring into play. Investigators would examine not only the killing but whether other offenses were committed, such as collecting information useful for terrorism, possessing material for terrorist purposes, encouraging terrorism, or preparing additional acts. Counterterrorism policing has expressly said that it will consult prosecutors if further offenses are identified. This leaves open the possibility of additional charges, although none should be assumed from the present murder prosecution. The wider consequences for Britain. A confirmed terrorist motive would make Widdecombe's killing more than the murder of a well-known former parliamentarian. It would indicate that a public figure had allegedly been selected because of her political identity or views, and attacked in a private home to advance a broader ideological purpose. That would place the case alongside Britain's darkest attacks on political representatives. Jo Cox was murdered in 2016 by a far-right extremist, while Sir David Amess was murdered in 2021 by an attacker motivated by Islamist extremism. Both killings forced the country to confront the vulnerability of politicians carrying out ordinary activities away from heavily protected government buildings. Widdecombe was no longer a sitting MP, making the security question more difficult. Protection systems are primarily designed around current office holders, known threats, and public events. Former ministers, former MPs, and politically prominent campaigners may remain highly recognizable while receiving far less institutional protection. Police are already working with the Speaker of the House of Commons and relevant authorities to ensure elected representatives understand the protective measures available. If terrorism is established, pressure would grow for a broader reassessment covering former MPs, candidates, party spokespeople, and other people whose political visibility survives long after they leave Parliament. The investigation could also trigger scrutiny of whether any warning signs were missed. The disclosure that the suspect was not known to prevent does not prove that the system failed, because many violent offenders never enter official counter-extremism channels. It would, however, intensify examination of online radicalization, isolated ideological fixation, and the challenge of identifying individuals who do not belong to an organized group. What happens next? The immediate case remains a murder prosecution. Kerry has been remanded in custody, and the evidence against him must be tested through the criminal courts. The prosecution has warned that he retains the right to a fair trial, and that public commentary must not create a substantial risk of serious prejudice. Investigators will continue processing the hundreds of active inquiries already identified. Digital devices, journey records, surveillance footage, financial activity and communications are likely to be central to establishing whether the alleged attack involved political purpose, ideological commitment, personal fixation, theft, or a combination of motives. The decisive development will not be the continued presence of counterterrorism police by itself. It will be whether prosecutors eventually allege a terrorist connection in court, add further offenses, or present evidence showing that Widdecombe was attacked not merely because of who she was, but because the alleged violence was intended to advance a cause or influence a wider audience. Until then, the strongest conclusion is also the narrowest one. Police consider the possible political or terrorist motive serious enough to justify a national counterterrorism investigation, but they have not publicly established that motive as fact. The distinction will determine whether the case remains an exceptionally brutal targeted murder or becomes a terrorist attack with consequences extending far beyond one isolated home on Dartmoor.